35 horsepower, maybe 50. It depends who you ask. If you want the full technical breakdown of what actually changed and whether it holds up, stick around and subscribe now, because this is the story that decides Aston Martin's second half of the season.
Right, let's actually pull this apart properly, because most of the coverage this week has flattened two completely different testing days into one big Aston Martin tests new engine headline, and that's doing a disservice to what actually happened. Tuesday and Wednesday at the Hungaroring were not the same exercise, and conflating them misses the point entirely. Tuesday's running used the old specification AMR 26 with Jack Crawford at the wheel, purely as part of Pirelli's 2027 tyre development programme, and Aston Martin weren't alone in that. Audi and Alpine were both there running the same test. Lower downforce, an older aero concept, less load through the contact patch. Now, on paper, that sounds like a step backwards for a team trying to prove progress, but from a tyre engineering standpoint, it's actually the more useful data set. Pirelli needs a range of load and grip inputs to build a compound for next year, not just data from whatever the fastest car in the paddock happens to be doing. So running the old car wasn't a mistake or a scheduling quirk. It was the correct tool for that specific job. And it cost Aston Martin nothing, because both chassis were already sitting in the garage regardless. Wednesday was a different exercise altogether, and a much more consequential one. The new specification Honda power unit went into the current B-Spec chassis, and the car went out purely to validate the hardware. Not to set a lap time, not to put on a show for whoever happened to be trackside with a camera. That distinction matters more than it sounds. This wasn't a performance demonstration, it was a validation exercise. And the fact Aston Martin structured their Pirelli allocation specifically to free up a full day for it tells you how seriously Honda wanted uninterrupted, focused running before they had to commit this engine to a genuine Grand Prix weekend at Zandvoort.
Is a gain over 200 kilometers actually reliable, or is it just unbroken so far? And if that piston redesign fails at Zandvoort, does Aston Martin have any plan B at all?
Now onto what actually changed inside the unit itself, because this is where it gets properly technical. Shintaro Orihara was fairly candid about the specifics: a reshaped pre-combustion chamber and a revised piston geometry. If you're not from an engineering background, here's why that matters more than it might sound. Piston crown shape directly influences compression behavior, how resistant the engine is to knock, that's uncontrolled premature ignition of the fuel-air mixture, and how much thermal load gets dumped into the crown itself during combustion. Get that geometry right, and you can genuinely improve combustion efficiency, which is exactly where extra horsepower comes from without simply running the engine harder or hotter. Get the tolerances even slightly wrong, and you're looking at exactly the kind of failure mode that ends a power unit's life early. Usually not in a nice controlled test environment, but mid-stint under full load in the middle of a Sunday afternoon. That's the trade-off Orihara himself pointed to when he described this as a major challenge in terms of reliability. He wasn't being cautious for the sake of it. That's a genuine engineering tension between chasing performance and protecting durability, and Honda have chosen deliberately to push toward the performance side of that line mid-season, which is not a decision manufacturers take lightly. There's a second layer to this story that's had almost no attention, and I'd argue it's more structurally important than the horsepower figure everyone's fixated on. Alonso specifically referenced Aston Martin helping Honda with consistency lap to lap on deployment, and with software support more broadly. To understand why that matters, you need to know what changed under the 2026 regulations. This generation of power unit has no MGUH. The turbo recovery element that used to help manage energy balance across a lap is gone entirely, and electrical deployment now accounts for close to half of total power output, up from a much smaller share previously. That's a fundamentally different energy management problem. Under the old rules, if your deployment strategy was slightly inconsistent, you lost a bit of lap time here and there. Under this generation of engine, with electrical power making up roughly half the total output, any inconsistency in battery state management or deployment mapping doesn't just cost you a tenth. It shows up as genuinely unpredictable lap time, corner to corner, lap to lap. For a driver, that's one of the hardest things to work around, because you can't build confidence in a braking point or a throttle application if the power delivery underneath you isn't repeatable. If Aston Martin have actually made real progress on that software side, working directly with Honda's engineers rather than just supplying chassis parts, that's arguably a bigger structural fix than the piston redesign, even though it doesn't come with a headline number attached to it. On the raw output figure itself, let's be honest about what we actually know versus what's being reported. Autosport's figure sits at around 35 horsepower. Other outlets have pushed that closer to 50. Honda haven't confirmed an exact number, and there's good reason for that beyond simple caution. Competitively, there's very little upside in telling Mercedes, Ferrari, or Red Bull exactly how much ground you've closed before you've even raced the thing. The honest answer is probably somewhere in that range, and it likely won't firm up until Honda have banked considerably more mileage than a single filming day allows. Translate that into lap time, and the number is track dependent, which is a point that tends to get flattened in most coverage. At a circuit like Zandvoort, short straights, high-speed direction changes, a layout that isn't particularly power sensitive by Formula One standards, the gain works out to somewhere in the region of half a second. That's not a universal figure. On a power-sensitive track like Monza, the exact same horsepower gain would be worth considerably more in lap time terms, because more of the lap is spent at or near full throttle. Add the new gearbox arriving at the same race, which, worth stressing, is about shift quality and mechanical balance rather than outright power, and you can reasonably stack another couple of tenths on top of the engine gain alone. None of that accounts for setup optimization the car still hasn't had time for. This chassis has had generously 2.5 days of meaningful running since its introduction. There is lap time sitting in this package that simply hasn't been extracted yet, and that's before any of the confirmed aerodynamic work for Baku and Monza lands. It's worth being precise about where this leaves the overall picture, because the engine is genuinely only half the story here. The 16-part B-Spec package already delivered a result you can actually trust because it happened under real race conditions rather than a private test. Alonso through to Q2 for the first time all season, Aston Martin leapfrogging Williams, Cadillac and Haas in the pecking order, Stroll bringing the car home in P13, one place ahead of his teammate. That's chassis and aero work alone, on a car with barely any setup time behind it, at a circuit that historically hasn't flattered cars with a straight line deficit. Combine that already banked result with the engine and gearbox gains we've just talked through, and you're looking at a genuinely reshaped competitive position for the second half of the season, not a marginal midfield shuffle. And there's more still to come. Newey has confirmed further chassis packages at both Baku and Monza. Expect continued weight reduction, still arguably the single most reliable form of lap time in this sport, because a lighter car simply doesn't need to be dragged around the circuit by an engine that's already working hard enough. The floor looks set for further revision, likely simplified relative to the current iteration rather than more complex, and the rear end, suspension geometry specifically, along with the diffuser, appears to be the next real area of focus. Front wing and side pods had their major update already in the B-Spec package, so I wouldn't expect significant change there in the short term. That development window looks closed for now. Now here's where I'll give you my actual read on all of this, rather than just relaying the data. I think the chassis side of this story is considerably more secure than the engine side, and that distinction matters when you're trying to work out how much of this is real. A 1.5 seconds in Hungary on a car that had barely any setup time is a result you can genuinely trust, because it happened in competitive conditions, under scrutiny, with a result on the timing screens to back it up. The engine gain is not yet in that category. It's a number derived from limited running on a filming day without the thermal stress or durability demands of a full Grand Prix weekend behind it. Those are two very different categories of evidence, and I think a lot of the excitement this week has treated them as equally solid when they simply aren't. My honest expectation is that Zandvoort tells us considerably more than this test did. Not because the horsepower figure is wrong, but because 200 kilometers of running is genuinely not enough to know whether that redesigned piston survives a full race distance under sustained load. If it does hold up, Aston Martin have a genuinely competitive midfield package on their hands. One I'd argue is capable of fighting for 5th fastest outright across a normal weekend, with the occasional chaotic session where a struggling Red Bull is realistically within range. If it doesn't hold up, this becomes a very familiar Honda story. A promising number followed by a difficult execution. And it's a pattern this sport has seen from them more than once before. Given Honda's own history swings from genuinely dominant, championship-winning power units to genuinely embarrassing reliability seasons within the space of only a few years, I'd call this cautiously optimistic rather than confirmed. The platform building angle heading into 2027 is real, and there's a reasonable comparison to draw with where Mercedes sat back in 2011, properly quick in isolated moments, stuck just behind the true front-runners, building steadily towards something considerably bigger a few seasons later. But I wouldn't stake the second half of this season on a piston redesign with 200 kilometers on the clock. Ask me again after Zandvoort when we've actually seen it under race pressure.